If you've ever wondered what FOIA, or the Freedom of Information Act, is, and how it relates to wild horse and burro issues, then this episode is for you. Welcome to Freedom for Wild Horses, Episode 20. I'm your host, Carol Walker, and let's get started. Welcome to the Freedom for Wild Horses podcast, the place to find out about wild horses in the American West and what you can do to help them stay wild and free. If you love wildlife, wild horses, and the freedom that they stand for, this show is for you. I'm your host, Carol Walker. Let's get started. Welcome to episode 20 of Freedom for Wild Horses, and I am absolutely delighted to have Debbie Coffey on here with me today to talk about the Freedom of Information Act. I've known Debbie for many years, and she is one of the unsung heroes of the wild horse advocacy movement. She has been doing so much work behind the scenes to get information, dig information out, get information to people who can help the wild horses. And she did an incredible radio show called Wild Horse and Burro Radio for 6 years, which is still archived, and you can find all the episodes. And she interviewed so many people who had any sort of help or information about wild horses. I was on her show a number of times, and she is also a tremendous expert on the Freedom of Information Act and has been filing Freedom of Information requests for the past 12 years and has helped a number of nonprofit organizations with getting information and also being able to do lawsuits. So I'm delighted to have her here today. Welcome.
Thanks, Carol. I'm honored to be on your podcast. Thank you so much for inviting me. I think I'd like to start by just explaining to everyone a little bit about the Freedom of Information Act, called FOIA, and why it's so important. The Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, was signed into federal law by President Lyndon Johnson, and FOIA gave the public the right to access records from any federal agency. And I think everybody can understand how important this is for our democracy to keep our government transparent and accountable. FOIA has been used to get records that revealed threats to the public's health and safety, government misconduct and waste. It's just, if we want a good working government, we need FOIA, and we need for agencies to comply with this law. FOIA does allow agencies to redact certain information when we get records. Like, there are 9 exemptions, and this includes redactions to protect national security and personal privacy. They're very specific on what they can redact. And sometimes they get a little overzealous, and then you can challenge these redactions in a FOIA lawsuit. We've had to do this many times. Since FOIA is a federal law, it only applies to federal agency records, like the Department of Interior, the Department of Agriculture, the State Department, and the programs that are within those agencies, like the Bureau of Land Management, things like that. FOIA doesn't apply to Congress or the judicial system. And since FOIA is a federal law, it doesn't apply to state or local governments, although states and local governments can sometimes have sunshine laws, for an open government. So people can access public records, things like that. I thought I might start out today just by talking about some really interesting FOIAs we've gotten. And I think everybody may be most familiar with the story of Tom Davis, the kill buyer, who bought 1,794 horses from the Bureau of Land Management, then sold them to slaughter in Mexico. They put out a summary for the public, but, they did a big investigation, and those records were very interesting. And there was another time, BLM Sally Spencer, who was the Wild Horse and Burro marketing specialist, after they got an early alert email that Tom Davis might be a kill buyer. So 70 people must have known about it in the BLM. After this email, she still sold 214 wild horses to Tom Davis, knowing that he was suspected of sending horses to slaughter. And also, you'll see in the sample FOIA records I sent you, Sally Spencer was willing to sell 10,000 horses to be slaughtered in Canada. And this was in emails regarding Nick Aladusti, a Canadian businessman. So if people want to look on your website, and sometimes it's really powerful when you see the actual pages and you see what they're saying. I always find when I'm looking at emails and I see what they're saying, it's kind of shocking sometimes.
And so the records will often include emails.
And most recently, American Wild Horse Campaign received FOIA records regarding the wild horses from the BLM's Adoptive Incentive Program, AIP. And during their investigation, it takes a lot of hard work and time to review all these records. You really have to thread the information together. And they discovered the AIP horses were ending up in kill pens and in the slaughter pipeline. And I just wanted to say, American Wild Horse Campaign right now seems to be at the forefront of filing many FOIAs for the public about wild horses and burros. And they're working diligently on many FOIA lawsuits to get records regarding wild horses and burros. They're also posting FOIA documents on their website so people can go on there and look at these FOIA records. They're just putting them up there for everybody to share with everybody. I've really been impressed with their FOIA work because not a lot of advocacy, wild horse and burro advocacy organizations are filing Freedom of Information Act requests. And while we're on the subject, we've had some really great public interest attorneys. They don't get paid as much as other attorneys. They take a portion of their time, it's negotiated at the end of a lawsuit. They do this because they love transparency in our country and they care about FOIA. So there's some really great FOIA attorneys we're working with in Oregon. I'm going to be Dan Stoddard, Pete Storenson, and Dan Stoddard has some other attorneys working with him. So we really appreciate all their hard work.
And you call in the attorneys when you are not able to get the records that you submit the requests for, correct?
Yes. What happens? We file a FOIA request, and then maybe 4, 5, 6 months later, we keep asking when we can expect the records. And most times we don't get a response. A lot of times they're supposed to give us a FOIA number within 20 days. And we're having a problem with that right now because we used to submit FOIAs on FOIAonline.org, and that was great. It gave you, as soon as you submitted your request, it gave you a FOIA number. Well, now you have to file it on FOIA.gov, and it gives you like a receipt number, but not a FOIA number. So now, again, I'm waiting for the Washington FOIA office to send a FOIA number. And last time I had to get the liaison involved just to get a FOIA number. So, their system isn't operating really efficiently.
And a lot of times you get partial or you get no records. And that's when you have to get the attorneys involved.
Yeah. They'll give us a link. It's here. Well, we happen to know from manuals and handbooks that there are a lot more we can prove there are a lot more records and they didn't do an adequate search. And mostly it's about them doing an adequate search, not if we think there's more records or there might be more records. We have to say, you are required to keep these records. Where are they? We want them. Or if we get the records and it mentions another record we didn't get, that's called a cross-reference, and then we can ask for those records in a lawsuit or an appeal. We say if we just get a few records, but you think they're more, the first step is to file an appeal, and we've filed many appeals. And then they might not even send all the records. They might send a few things. You can either file another appeal, or at that point, you could file a lawsuit. And, once you've exhausted every other way to try and get records, then you go to a lawsuit. We don't just willy-nilly jump into lawsuits.
Right. Well, and then how many people even know how to do this?
They don't. It's so crazy. FOIA should be for the average American person. Say that somebody sees there is a mine going up near their property and they want to find out some specific records about like what is the BLM saying to these people or something. So they want to file a FOIA. They wouldn't know where to file it. They can probably look online and file where to file it. But the BLM is so picky about the language to use, they can just, if it's not quote unquote clear or they can't understand it, and now they want you to tell them where to file the records, like they can't find them. They're making it very difficult for people to get these records. Some other interesting FOIA records, we found out quite a few years ago, the BLM was considering sending about 2,000 wild horses to be used as prey for Siberian tigers and Amur leopards as a pilot program in Russia. And we also got some records that showed Lon Ball and his Russian partners discussing killing our wild horses for food for Russian soldiers. And BLM was working hard on a plan to send wild horses to Guyana to be used on a cattle ranch there to build up their breeding. And the BLM was trying to find ways for U.S. taxpayers to pay for the transportation. They contacted the State Department. They contacted the Department of Defense, USAID, and they call it transferring the horses or giving them gifts, any way they could find to get rid of horses.
And you never would have found this out had you not submitted a FOIA request.
Yeah. They don't tell the people they're trying to send the horses to Russia or Guyana. Not a peep about it. It's very secretive. Especially, in Guyana, while this plan didn't directly call for horses to be used as prey, there's many jaguars in the area that are killing cattle, and also tropical diseases there. The BLM was very aware that they were likely to succumb to tropical diseases. So the BLM still continues their plans anyway. So, it's uncovering, they can say to the public, we really care about the wild horses. And then when you see these records, you see the exact opposite. They care about getting rid of them. They care about looking good to the public, like lipstick on a pig. They care about themselves, basically, or just, I don't know. They don't care about the wild horses and burros.
And then you also have gotten a lot of records of mortality at holding facilities. And this is just shocking to find out how many horses actually are dying in these holding facilities. And we would never find that out just asking the BLM.
Yeah. We talked about the Bruno off-range corrals. Carol, remember that?
Bruno, Idaho. Yes.
Yeah.
I went and visited after the roundup 2017, I believe it was, in Adobe Town and Saltwells Creek. And they had a 1-day visit because it's a private facility that you could go to. And I found out that there had been a lot of foals that had died. When I asked how many, they said, well, file a FOIA.
And you let me know, and I filed a FOIA.
And you did. And it was shocking how many horses had died.
Yeah.
There's something terribly wrong when you have, what was it, 110 stillborn foals? That's just not normal.
Yeah, it turns out that 34 foals died. There were 101 stillborn foals. And on top of that, 48 mares died. And that was all within a year, I think, or less.
Yes. Something terribly wrong at that facility. And because it's a private facility and they don't let the public in, you have no way of knowing unless you file a FOIA.
And the BLM, nowhere on their website do they have any accounting for the deaths at any of these facilities. And they get the deaths every month when they have an inventory that the contractors of both long-term pastures and long-term corrals are required to send into them their inventory and how many deaths. But the BLM doesn't report it to the public. So, it's a big issue that they're just so secretive. I wanted to get back just for a second to that plan to send wild horses to Guyana. It was being pushed by Michael Ned, who's currently the BLM's Deputy Director of Operations. And Ned was born and raised in Guyana before coming to the U.S. in 1976 when he was about 17 years old. So of all the countries in the world, suddenly the ambassadors to Guyana, when you look back to the records, I tried to trace it back. Like, when did this start? How did it start, this plan? So the ambassador of Guyana suddenly sends a letter. Hey, we'd like some horses to, come over here for a breeding. And I'm thinking there's no country closer that has horses, and then they're trying to get the American taxpayer to foot the bill for this.
Yes, the transport alone would just be astronomical.
Uh-huh. And another really interesting thing that I'm going to bring up here, since we're talking about Michael Ned, who's still currently the BLM's Deputy Director of Operations. In 2021, there was a news article regarding Eric Criley, and he was a former State Department special agent, 20 years, serving as a law enforcement officer in the government. He was in Afghanistan. He was later appointed to be the director of BLM's Office of Law Enforcement and Security. And this is kind of like their internal investigations unit. Well, Criley was removed from his job and put on administrative leave after he first reported to senior Interior Department officials what he called ethical violations and improper influence by his immediate supervisor, who was Mike Ned. So, they shipped him off somewhere. Be interesting for someone to do a radio show with him. That's what I'm thinking.
If you could ever get to him, right?
Yeah. And I think, Carol, I'm going to go way back here for everybody. This was one of the things that really got me interested in filing FOIAs. One of the most interesting releases of FOIA records was done by the late Dr. Patricia Haight, and she was with the Conquistador program. And Dr. Haight obtained records regarding a team of 10 BLM employees who were planning alternative management options, in quotation marks, I'll say, for wild horses and burros. And shockingly, this plan included mass euthanasia. And, some of the employees that were part of this 10-person team are still active with the BLM's Wild Horse and Burro program. They include Alan Shepard, who's now Nevada State Deputy State Director of Resources, John Neal, has been at the Palomino Valley corrals for many years. And I think he's now a contracting officer's representative to a lot of some long-term holding places or corrals. And then there's also BLM's Gus War and Joe Stratton. And I'm not sure if they're still with BLM or they've retired, those two. But anyhow, at the beginning of these BLM team notes that I looked at, it said all correspondence that is generated by this team will not be for the public. That scared me right there. Like, what? Why? And so one of the first things they said was, if large numbers of animals become eligible for euthanasia at one time or at one location, euthanasia could be performed on or off site. Under this option, any facility could become a focal point for the public, media, or congressional attention. Why don't they want any congressional attention? Could something they're doing be illegal? They said increased levels of security would be needed at all locations, or the activity may need to be moved off-site to a more appropriate and secure facility. Increased support from public relations and management staff would also be needed to insulate those doing the work from the public, media, and congressional scrutiny and criticism.
Right.
What is the mindset of these are public employees paid for with your tax dollars.
Yes.
So to talk about hiding things from you, if they don't need to hide things if they know they aren't wrong.
Right. And obviously mass euthanasia is very wrong. And it's not even euthanasia. You're talking about killing healthy horses, basically.
Yeah. It's not like, horses suffering or something.
Yes.
And that would mean foals, young horses, old horses. They even talked about getting psychological counseling for people that had to euthanize the horses. They said 20-year-old horses would be euthanized at the trap site, preferred, or preparation facility. John Neal talked with Reno Rendering to see if they would take how many horses, and they could take as many as the BLM could take there. They were wondering how many horses could be euthanized during a gather without having NEPA. And this team also discussed creating non-reproducing herds, and that would likely lead to the extinction of wild horses and burros. And also they talked about adjusting the sex ratios of herds. And not that we haven't heard that mentioned before, but get this, they said, does it affect behavior and do we care?
Right.
Do we care? We
Of course
care.
they don't, but we do, yes.
Yeah. And they said, since we do not have any evidence this is bad, the BLM should be allowed to do this on a large scale. I mean, this is just crazy. And Carol, you and I have talked about if there are budget cuts. We've always worried about a mass euthanasia situation.
Yes, because this has not disappeared from the BLM. This is still on their minds. We know that. And if there is a massive budget cut, like they were talking about in the House, cutting $73 million off the budget, where would they go to cut back? The holding facilities. And a lot of people don't know that there's over 60,000 wild horses in holding facilities right now.
That's the biggest part of the program budget is the holding facilities.
The holding facilities, exactly, which is absurd.
I always like to remind taxpayers they were grazing for free on public lands.
Yes, they were grazing for free and
not costing a penny.
And of course, the livestock we call grazing on public lands on the public dime welfare ranchers, because they're grazing at a very low rate, $1.35 per cow calf pair. And the grazing program loses, millions of dollars every year, because the actual cost is probably closer to $20 if you were going to do it on private land. And another issue that has just come up, Deb, which is really interesting to me, is that cattle are not the same as they used to be. They are much larger than they used to be. So the AUMs should actually be adjusted for all of the public lands where they are grazing, because these are much bigger cattle. If they're a third bigger, that makes a big difference to how much forage they consume.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you. Also, another reason why the Freedom of Information Act is so important right now and becoming more so by the day is I have seen since 2017 how much the BLM has become less transparent with the public. Starting back in 2017, I noticed the BLM suddenly, and I've been doing research for years, suddenly the BLM started scrubbing most of its links off the internet. So they were basically erasing their history from public view. The first thing they did was remove the directories for district offices and field offices, making it difficult for people to find who was the wild horse and burro specialist at that field office, who was the hydrologist, or other personnel. In case you had a question, they had their email address or phone number. You could contact them to ask questions. And that's how if you want to make public comments about, their environmental assessment plans or something, any environmental plans that have public comments, you might need to ask a question. So you don't know who is where at any time, and they're always shuffling their employees around. I could not tell you right now who is a wild horse and burro specialist at any place. I think
I can because I know the offices, but that's the only reason. I mean, it's not obvious from the websites at all.
No. And so first I noticed that they didn't have the directories. And then about that same time, they started scrubbing the internet. And suddenly you'd go to a link, it would say page not found, or links are no longer cached. And I noticed that the BLM also suddenly removed all the state and district websites. Instead, they created one big BLM website. This made it harder for people, for example, if you wanted to find out about proposed mining or oil drilling in certain BLM districts, because you used to be able to just go and they'd have their drilling and their grazing or their wild horses all on the district page or field office page. And now you have to go to their main site and you really have to dig around to find that information, or go to e-planning and look at everything. So,
and there used to be, on all of the different field offices that had wild horses, there used to be maps, there used to be descriptions of the herds. Now there's like a tiny paragraph, a description of the herd, and all that information is gone. It's just stunning and a huge loss.
Yeah. And when I first started doing research, that's how I learned. I just started noodling around on the internet, I'd Google things. Well, I couldn't find stuff anymore, even about, when I went on the main website, say I wanted to look up something about Dean Bolstadt. He was the head of the Wild Horse and Burro program. Only about 3 or 4 things came up, maybe 5 at the most, with his name in it. So I called the BLM Public Affairs specialist to ask some questions about the defunct websites and links. And he said in the past, there were about 90,000 pages. And then a little bit later, he said, it could probably be only 60,000 pages of BLM content on the internet, but they couldn't be managed or updated and weren't centralized. So they just took everything off. And I'm thinking, if they got a better, server or something, why couldn't they keep those 90 pages up? Why did they have to they didn't have to really maintain them. They didn't have to be centralized, just leave them out there. And then what he said, most importantly, he said there were now standards to reduce the amount of pages contents. Have you ever really heard them talk about reducing information available to the public?
Oh, that's just sickening. No.
Yeah.
Well, they don't want to admit it.
No. But this is what's been happening since 2017. So as the BLM made it less information easily available to the public, they also continued to make it extremely difficult to get FOIA records. And this is even when you're in a lawsuit, it's difficult to get the records. You have to fight for every page you get practically. And the sad thing is, even members of the media, like news organizations, have trouble getting FOIA records in an expedited manner. If they have to do a story in a few days, or, they have a deadline, they may not get it expedited, or so many of them don't even try to get FOIA records anymore because it's like hopeless for them. I've seen a lot of, like reporters' websites in FOIA, and they're always complaining about how all these agencies drag their feet. Oh, their backlog, can't do it. So instead of getting records, they get a quick soundbite from a PR person, like a BLM PR person. And these quotes are often very different from the information indicated directly within FOIA records, the real documents we get.
If the public information officer even tells them anything,
Yeah.
Sometimes the news organizations can't even get a hold of somebody from BLM to talk to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the BLM always complains they can't comply with FOIA law because they're backlogged. Well, part of the problem with that, Carol, they don't hire enough FOIA personnel to handle, they know the FOIA has increased, but they've barely hired any more people to take care of extra FOIA requests. And just to give you some idea, they are not complying with the federal law. The Department of Interior has 70,000 employees, but they only have 133 full-time FOIA personnel. This is how much they care about being transparent to the public. They don't really care. And of that, 99 are full-time employees, and then they count 39.65 as equivalent full-time. That means people are being taken away from their staff jobs to help search for records that aren't really full-time employees. They get training, but they're still not FOIA personnel. Now, the BLM alone has 10,000 employees, but they only have 23 FOIA personnel. Again, that's 20 full-time employees, and then they added in 2.5 equivalent full-time. And they're and every year it seems like they're like, I think in 22 or 23, they're like almost 1,300 FOIA requests behind. So they're not.
Oh my gosh. How many get filed a year about, Deb?
I think the last year I saw was 22. I think it was about 900 and something. But not only they're not keeping up, they're breaking the law. They're not complying with federal law. So you have a federal agency not complying with federal law. So, and not making any attempts to do so. But they're rounding up those horses and spending money to round them up.
Exactly. It seems like, all the money from the BLM gets channeled to housing, warehousing, and rounding up horses. And then there's just not enough money for anything else.
And another big issue, they're complaining that they're backlogged. I remember Dean Bolstad, who used to be head of the Wild Horse and Burro program, he got up at some meeting and he was complaining about FOIA's requests. Like he didn't want so many.
But they existed, right?
Yeah. He was complaining. So anyhow, but there's been many instances, and I think you've experienced this, when wild horse advocates will ask someone in the BLM a question and they're told to file a FOIA.
Yes, that's the new thing. At roundups, when I was at the checkerboard roundup in 2021, 2022, I was told that a couple of times. Instead of being given the information at the time, I asked the BLM staffer, which is insane. I mean, because look at how much bureaucracy that puts in the way. And clearly, there's no reason to do that unless you don't want people to know what's going on.
Yeah. The Bureau of Land Management has a very historically adversarial relationship with the American public, unless they're ranchers. But,
yes.
Like they consider anyone that advocates for the well-being and care of wild horses and burros like their enemy, it seems, like it's really disgusting.
And it's especially disgusting given that we're paying their salary. We, the American people, are paying their salary. They are government employees, and they should be helpful. And supposedly, if they actually wanted to care for these wild horses, there's a lot of things they wouldn't be doing that they are doing. There was a roundup in the Red Desert Complex. Deb actually filed a FOIA, which helped me find my little adopted Mustang because I had no idea where he went. And most people who love a particular herd and particular horses are given no help by the BLM as far as being able to find the horses. If you have a good description of a horse and you can see the list of horses that were rounded up, which is what Deb provided, then you have a better shot at actually being able to find them. But otherwise, there's no priority given to finding adopters for these horses. And one would think that a horse is more likely to get a long-term home from somebody who actually cares about them than one of these AIP adopters who just want their money.
And I wanted to let people know, because another thing the BLM tells the public, they don't keep the files locally. Well, just so all of you know, the BLM maintains a database called the Wild Horse and Burro Program System, WHBPS database for short. It contains all records about all the horses, transportation. They can look it up by the freeze mark number, where it was gathered from, their disposition, just so people can know that that database exists. And these people could definitely just, if you call them, click on their computer. Every field office has it. Every wild horse and burro specialist has access to it. Anybody can answer your questions.
But the question is, will
If they want, if they will, yeah.
And increasingly, it's no.
I'm wondering, Carol, if people should start writing their congressional representatives to complain that these agency personnel are not answering their questions when asked.
I think that's a very good thing for people to know.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. If they start getting enough complaints about it, maybe the BLM would change their policy and, answer some questions from the public.
It's a climate of non-transparency, basically.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And it's even gotten to the point where now when there's a roundup, they used to give us about a month notice, which wouldn't allow people to get out there to observe. Now they're giving us about 3 days.
Yeah. And doesn't give people time to get planned to who's going to take care of their dogs or horses while you're gone, make a hotel reservation, motel reservation.
Exactly. Take time off work, whatever.
They don't want you watching. They don't want the public watching.
They don't want the public knowing any of this stuff. And so for them, if the FOIAs are backlogged, great. Mm-hmm. That means less information is out there.
Mm-hmm. It seems that both the Department of Interior and the BLM, they have a history. I will say the word hostility towards transparency in FOIA. They just do not want to give over records. And examples of this in 2018, the BLM wanted new legislation that would limit the number of FOIA requests from individuals and agencies like news agencies. And they wanted to charge more for searches. Yeah, they don't want me filing more than 2 FOIAs a year if they could. That would be a dream for them. And then in 2019, David Bernhardt, who was then Secretary of the Interior, he actually formalized a policy that allowed political appointees to review all the documents requested by a FOIA before they were released to the public.
Oh, my God. And can you imagine that would add years to getting them?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's, that's not part of the law. That's actually censorship. And that brings me up to another little thing. One of the things they do, like if I file for emails, the BLM actually has that person gather their own emails. That's like the fox guarding the hen house. Oops, shouldn't have said that. No matter how important it is, too easy to just not provide that record.
Exactly.
Instead, if they were ethical, they would have an IT person who's impartial go in and they don't need to take the BLM person's time away from it. They have an IT person, goes in there, gathers emails, but they use search terms, so you're not going to get their personal emails on a work thing. They use search terms like, a certain herd or, disposition. The BLM is so archaic and they seem to lag behind. They even keep a lot of the livestock grazing allotment records and permittee records in hard files and papers in a field office rather than digitizing these records. If the records were digitized, it would be easy for an IT person to obtain these records and free up BLM office personnel from spending time shuffling through papers, moving Post-its, whatever, I can't believe they still keep records in paper hard files. And the funny thing, ordinary Americans should be able to file a FOIA for records. And the BLM gets around this by saying, oh, yeah, we'll give you the records, but we'll charge you $5,000 for the time we need to search for them. Well, if everything were digitized, then average Americans could afford to get FOIA records. Only nonprofits can qualify for a fee waiver if it's not news media. Recently, one Department of Justice attorney was complaining, nonprofits file FOIAs. So, yeah, because the public can't afford to.
Exactly.
And government agencies also seem to be becoming much pickier about the request language itself. So how are ordinary Americans supposed to be experts at writing FOIA requests?
Exactly. You've told me at times that you have to narrow the focus because otherwise then they won't give you the records.
Yeah, narrow the focus. Use be careful the wording you use because it's not how you would speak normally. I want this and that. You have to say this or that. Otherwise, they'll go, oh, you want both apples and oranges? Sorry, we don't have that. We only have apples or we have oranges. Just that's kind of their mentality.
And it's also a very powerful tool for a lawsuit because you obviously need to dig up facts to be able to bring a lawsuit.
Yeah, and that's where, I always advise people, you need to look at manuals and handbooks to see what records are required to be kept by the agencies or even their instruction memorandums. So you know what they're supposed to do. Because then, it's not like you say there should be records or there might be records. You have to tell, like if I file an appeal, I have to tell them why I know records are missing. And in the lawsuit, you especially have to be able to do that.
I meant in adding to, like, say, a lawsuit that's being brought against the BLM. You need to have these records.
Yeah. And even the BLM in lawsuits, even when you're in lawsuits, and just so people know, lawsuits are a lot of work. My hat is off to American Wild Horse Campaign now for the lawsuit work they're doing to get records. They've been just amazing on the FOIA front. And BLM searches for responsive records can sometimes be limited because the FOIA officer will let whoever is going to search for the records, and it could be someone in a field office that really doesn't know much about the topic, they can decide what search terms to use for an electronic search or where to look for records, and otherwise who they might think might have the records, when actually responsive records might be with other parties or something. So it's often very difficult to get records, even with a FOIA lawsuit. The good news is, for everybody, the FOIA lawsuits I've worked on have all been filed in the 9th District Court in Washington, D.C., and these are the best judges in the land in the United States. One of our recent Supreme Court justices was just selected from the 9th Court. So anyhow, and they care about FOIA law. So that is the really good thing. They really care about the Freedom of Information Act. So everybody can feel good about that. So
it's a very complex topic. And I think most people don't even really know what a FOIA request is. So this is very, very helpful, Deb. I really appreciate it. And all the years that you have spent digging for information and going through all of the hoops that the government makes you go through, I admire you tremendously for doing that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think it was one time I called someone to ask about Tom Davis. And when I got FOIA records sometime later, they sent an email out to say so-and-so called to ask about this or whatever it was I called to ask about. And they sent it to like 70 BLM employees or something.
Oh my gosh.
and they redacted my name, but I knew it was me because it was what I called and the date I called. So it was kind of funny. Well, anyhow, Carol, I hope you don't mind, but I'd like to take 1 second before we end the show for new wild horse and burro advocates who are beginning their research, trying to learn about these issues. I always recommend the American Herds blog spot to advocates. Cindy McDonald is a great researcher. She retired, but she's left this blog intact so that new advocates can kind of jumpstart their learning about wild horse and burro issues, and they can see some really great research. And it also adds some historical context to issues because things that were happening back then, they're still happening now. Nothing has gotten better, unfortunately, but I think to see the quality of her research, and they can learn from what she did. So I always encourage people to go to American Herds blog spot.
That's great.
And you too, Carol. Educating people about stuff. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about FOIA. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. And thank you for all your hard work. I hope people know you don't get paid for this. Carol's done so much work out of just the love for wild horses and burros. And thank you, Carol.
Thanks, Deb. Thank you for listening to this episode of Freedom for Wild Horses. If you want to learn more, follow me at www.wildhoofbeats.com for more information and for ways to help America's wild horses. See you next time.